I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Louis Cralley to NIOSH today. Dr. Cralley and his colleagues began the industrial hygiene field operations with the OSH Health Service in Cincinnati in 1950. Since most of us began our work at NIOSH after Dr. Cralley retired in 72, today we have the opportunity to hear about the work and accomplishments in occupational safety and health of his era. When I met Dr. Cralley 2 years ago, I was fascinated by his account of what it was like to do field work in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, and tremendously impressed by the struggle to continue to maintain occupational safety and health research programs. The foundation of our work today is truly laid by this work. Dr. Cralley continues to be active in the field today. He lives in Cincinnati and is continuing as a resource to us all. Just a side note, we'll be going to lunch after the seminar. If anyone would like to join, Louis and Ida Cralley, please do. We'll be gathering here after the seminar. With great pleasure that I present to you now, Dr. Louis Cralley.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I'm grateful for this opportunity of giving you some highlights in the history of industrial hygiene in the public health service. Back in the turn of the century, our nation faced a situation, a health crisis, unless studied and resolved, would influence the social structure of our country. Limited information in two areas. One in Vermont showed that a study of a number of workers, over 90% who had been there for 21 years or longer had tuberculosis. And another study in Joplin, Missouri, in one of the metal mines, it showed that the people who had been there for 20 years or longer, over about 64% had silicosis. Other studies following that gave this same portrait, and it was obvious that something had to be done because it would only get worse otherwise. There was 3 agencies in the federal government which had involvement. One, U.S. Public Health Service, U.S. Bureau of Mines, and U.S. Department of Labor. It fell on the shoulders of the first 2 to carry the bulk of this research, fact-finding, and problem resolution. The Department of Labor had its hand full in safety in industry at that time, and they were in a position to divide their forces and separate them into 2 different groups, 2 different studies. And since the studies were going on in the Bureau of Mines and the Public Health Service, they relied upon them to carry the ball in this area. The problem was, at this point, there was no profession available to study and present the situation and potentials for a resolution. The only people available were medical profession. They could well study the health status of the miners according to jobs, according to length of time in the mines or in the granite sheds or wherever. But it stopped at that point because that only told us what the story was, not anything about recognizing and resolving it. In 1914, the Public Health Service established the first organization relating to studying this problem. It was the Office of Industrial Hygiene and Sanitation. At that time, it only had medical officers, no environmental, just medical. The environmental was handled mainly by the Bureau of Mines at that time, and corporate studies were taking place in which Public Health Service provided the medical and Bureau of Mines the environmental services and data finding. I might just mention some of the people back in those earlier days You may have heard of Dr. Sherezvetsky, who was the first director of the Office of Industrial Hygiene and Sanitation. Along with him came Dr. Hodgkins, Dr. Meredith, Dr. Sayers, Dr. Thompson, and then Dr. Tony Lanza. You may have heard of him. He was more recently. It wasn't until 1922 that this office expanded to include an environmental aspect of their field studies. They secured Jack Bloomfield from the Bureau of Mines and Leonard Greenberg as a part of that office. Their charge was to develop information identifying, characterizing, and measuring exposure levels and control procedures for exposures in the work environment. That was a tough job at that time because none of these were available. As far as dust sampling is concerned, they had a few techniques, the sugar tube, a few others, but no tool used the same methods of collecting information, the samples and analyzing them. So one study by the Bureau of Mines or the Public Health Service would not relate to another one. About all it showed was things are pretty bad. That when Bloomfield and Greenberg came in, short after, Greenberg and Smith developed the impinger. And the problem with the impinger was that it was so large and cumbersome that it could only used to measure area concentrations of dust, or collect and measure them. And that didn't come along until later on, until the Bureau of Mines developed the midget impinger. That was accepted then as a method of collecting and measuring exposure levels for some 40 years. I'd like to jump now just a few steps forward to 1937. The Public Health Service and Surgeon General recognized the need for research in a number of areas, including occupational health, or that time called industrial hygiene. They established the National Institute of Health, whose sole purpose was research. This is composed of about 5 divisions, each having its own building in a campus-like atmosphere at Bethesda. I might jump back a little bit. Where did the name industrial hygiene come from? Backward about the time when they established this Office of Industrial Hygiene and Sanitation. They and a few others chose the name industrial hygiene. At that time, hygiene was used extensively in relation to health promotion and protection. So industrial hygiene was somebody engaged in protecting, promoting the health of workers. It was perfectly logical then, as far as I'll comment on it right now. But now back to the Institute. At that time, there were probably no more than 20, 25 professionals in the entire Institute, Division of Industrial Hygiene of the Institute, who were devoting their research to occupational health problems. That's not a very large organization compared to today. That included medical, engineering, chemical, statistical, nursing, toxicology. 25 people. Well, on the heels of that, 38, 39, came World War II. That had a profound influence on the development of industrial hygiene in the public health service. earlier on in World War I, things were so bad for the workers manufacturing TNT and shell and bomb loading and so forth that they didn't want this repeated. It was stated by, I believe, probably Tony Lansing. He said that it was estimated that more workers were killed from TNT poisoning than American soldiers killed on the front line. That gives you a little perspective of it. At that time, as earlier said, the only program available related to the medical and not to the control aspects, only to the medical. And they wanted to be sure that an epidemic didn't come along and wipe out the workers, so they had nobody manufacture explosives anymore. So and of course, knowledge was not available at that time of protecting workers from exposures. We hadn't advanced that far at that time. Well, there were two areas of activities as far as the manufacturing of explosives, shell loading, incendiary materials, and so forth. One was government-owned, Army-operated arsenals. The second, which came in very large, because it was several times that of the Army arsenal, was government-owned, privately operated manufacturing of war materials. And these are your explosive materials under Army administration. So you had a three-way triangle there. Well, the Army requested the Surgeon General Public Health Service take on the responsibility of monitoring health program for the group that government owned, privately operated. And the Surgeon General gave the responsibility directly to Jack Bloomfield. He says, you are responsible for everybody else what's going on, but you are responsible to me. I'll see that you get the money to operate this. This is an emergency. He says, we cut corners, but we keep other people informed. So, and at this time, we had this dynamic team of Jimmy Townsend, medical administration, and Jack Bloomfield, program coordinator and developer. And they worked very closely together. So this permitted this approach to establishing these arsenal crews. The arsenal crews, there were only about 20 people in the arsenal crews. It was very small. About five to seven arsenal teams. It consisted of 2 environmental people, 2 medical officers. A team, one would be medical, the other dermatology, and then maybe a specialist of some sort. Our job was to go into these arsenals, and that would include TNT manufacturing, tetra manufacturing, smokeless powder, incendiary materials, and they're loading into bomb shells and whatever. We used to monitor those situations. Our medical officers would get within medical department, see the trend. There was any trend of illnesses taking place, any problems developing, and then they would get with us, and we'd go out in the environment, and we would study that and get together with recommendations that they needed to follow. Interesting now, at the end of World War II, compared to what I told you about World War I, at the end of World War II, with the greatly expanded production of explosive materials and they're loading into shells and bombs, over the whole about 3.5 years, only 22 deaths from TNT poisoning. So it was a very effective program. Some very interesting things occurred, little anecdotes on this. One of them, Well, we were the arsenal crew were in Army khakis with insignia and so forth. The rest of the public health officers were in the Navy. Well, we were very conspicuous on the campuses. Every time we walked across, they knew that was the arsenal team. But not only that, in these arsenals, the Army had the administration. We couldn't go in there in blues and tell them. So they had a special ruling that the arsenal team only of public health service wore khakis. There were about 20 people who had khakis. We had special permission from the highest top that we would wear and be recognized by our khaki and our insignia and so forth. And an interesting thing developed on that. We, at that time, most of our travel was by train, but very little by plane, mostly by train. We had nationwide travel orders. We had our own travel vouchers. They could call us from Washington and change us from this place over to that place, and we never touched base at home. We could go right across. We were authorized to go from one place to the other according to emergencies. I was on a train one time, and I was a captain, a lieutenant. And we were back in the club car having a little relaxation and so forth. And he started asking questions to me. He says, Army, khaki, I don't recognize your insignia there. Oh, at that time, we were part, the Public Health Service, part of Federal Security Agency, was the overall organization. Federal Security Agency in time of war had a specific meaning. And we were standing there having a drink, and he started asking me, he said, I don't recognize any of your insignia here. Who are you? What do you do? And a major came up, and he says, Lieutenant, if any questions are asked here, the captain will do the asking. And then he looked at he says, dismissed. The lieutenant says, yes, sir. And he was dismissed. And then the major said to me, he says, I want to apologize for this embarrassing situation. He says, they don't know what some of us know concerning your assignments and responsibilities. I said, I very much appreciate the diplomacy you use in this situation. We shook hands. One other time, in World War II, George Clayton and I were given assignments to go down in Georgia. They had a new explosive, a plastic explosive. They wanted us to investigate what it was, potential hazards associated with the manufacturing and handling of materials and so forth. We went down there. We went to the commandant's office. We announced ourselves, showed our orders, everything's in order. And he says, well, he says, that's interesting. He says, what clearance do you people have? He says, you're not authorized to come into this facility and look at these things. He says, we'll have to contact base. He says, come back tomorrow morning and we'll see what we can find out on this deal. He says, oh, by the way, as you leave, you're in no hurry, go out to our room area where they have periodicals and things like that, reception room. He says, there's an open magazine there. Take a look at that. That gives you an idea. And that magazine had everything you wanted to know about this plastic explosion. It had the name, the chemical, it had everything on it. We were back this morning, and the captain says, did you look at the magazine? I said, yes. He says, it is sort of embarrassing at times, isn't it? He says, oh, by the way, this came to you, and it was a telegram from Jimmy Townsend saying, War is over. Return to base immediately. So we took over. Well, to get back to the, that takes pretty much the up through the World War II. It did establish us as a firm organization relating to occupational health, but into the Army, into government, into industry and other areas because of our relationship to arsenal crews and other assignments. After World War II, some serious problems arose. The National Institute of Health said we're going to limit our activities strictly to research. Well, our program had research in it, all right, but most of our effort was through Jack Bloomfield's direction, going out and developing industrial hygiene programs in state and local health departments. That activity was the responsibility of the Bureau of State Services, another organization, which is in downtown Washington, D.C. So our operations were transferred down to that new Bureau of State Services. A meeting was held in which the monies for this personnel was transferred from the National Institute Division of Industrial Hygiene over to the Bureau of State Services and the Division of Industrial Hygiene, all except the laboratories. The laboratories had to remain there on a temporary basis until a suitable relocation could be found. In this meantime, Jack Bloomfield led a program of developing industrial hygiene in state and local health departments. And during a period of several years, 2 or 3 years there, we had these programs established in all but 2 states, as I recall. Then came the situation of our laboratories. We wanted to get into research again. We did do a couple of research projects. One was the Denora project, and then a couple of others in air pollution. But we didn't have any ongoing projected research program for our laboratory people. Clyde Berry led a team. You may know that name. He led a team of 3 or 4 who went out to find a location. We investigated several public health service hospitals which were being closed, but they didn't seem suitable to that, and a couple other places, until finally it came to changing that. There was this building at 1014 Broadway, in which the first floor was completely vacant. It was an old warehouse used at that time. It was vacant. They looked at that and said, yes, this is possible. Well, at that time, Clyde at that time was head of the engineering section. He left to go with an oil company. Pete Yaffe took over as head of the engineering. While Townsend and Bloomfield were out of town, the NIH people called a meeting to discuss the transfer of money, the amount of money from the NIH, the old Industrial Hygiene Division, to the new division under Bureau of State Services, the amount of money being out, Townsend moved me out of town, and they had to have this meeting. They appointed Harley Casberg, a medical officer, and they asked, and me as the 2 to represent our division. We had held no discussions with anybody, anywhere, any place, on where we were going, what type of an organization, how large we wanted, what should we aim at. We had no information on how much it cost to operate the old NIH laboratory. We were flying blind, and I mean blind. I happen to know Norm Topping, who was at the National Institute of Health at that time, as deputy director, I guess it was. I'd been on some committee work with him. And that was a plus. They presented the program and transferred a certain amount of money. And they asked Hardy, they said, what do you think about it? He says, well, Lewis, he says, you're the one that knows about this laboratory area. He says, why don't you comment on it? I didn't know where they were seeking $1,000, $10,000, $100,000, you name it. Actually, blind. They presented the amount. Now, what to say about it? Well, I thought, well, you got to say something. You made it pretty general. I said, well, this looks fairly good for one little aspect of it. If we want to build a laboratory, this will go a long way in building it. I said, you forget, this does not take care of any of the personnel or their expense or any of our expense as far as field work is concerned and so forth. I says, you build a laboratory, it's a laboratory, but there are no people in it to operate it. That's where we stand right now. I said that doesn't quite make sense. And Norm Chopping said to me, well, listen, says, what do you suggest? I just grabbed him and I said, at least 2 to 3 times this amount. Norm says, Mr. Paul Niels, what do you think? He says, let's take the 2 times. And right then there we doubled the amount. I don't know what it was, but we doubled the amount. And it was enough to build the laboratories, provide the personnel, and the support of the personnel. When this was decided, they decided, we call it the Industrial Hygiene Field Headquarters. All the laboratory remained in Washington. The laboratory would go out to Cincinnati. We had I had a meeting to discuss the next steps, and Townsend Bloomfield appointed me as chief of the operations and told me to get a staff for their approval. I did, and I recommended Birmingham for medical dermatology, Yaffe for engineering, Byers for analytical, Fairhall toxicology, and I think there was Lalier for radiological. They approved that. Then they drew up designs, and they designated Art Doyle as our administrative officer, who was money bags. Well, we sent a crew of about 3. There was Yaffe and Byers, Keenan, and Art Doyle, as the vanguard, went out and moved to Cincinnati to follow the construction of the laboratories and so forth. These were constructed. They were completed in the 1950s, starting about 49, and about 50 they were completed. So, a little added thought here. The upstairs of that building was already occupied by the Water Quality Laboratory of the Sanitary Division of the Public Health Service. We had our dedication in 1950. We had quite a party, including good refreshments, shall we say. And Art Doyle got a camera, and he had one of his personnel take all kinds of pictures of these big. They had people from medical directors from industry, the state health department, city health department. And we had all the bigwigs there. We probably had close to 100 people there. He took all kinds of pictures, and so he did. He came up later that day. He says, Art, I forgot to put film in the camera. Art says, question. He says, all right, we have this. You follow me. He says, I'm going around to all these various places, and I'll tell Dr. Townsend, we want some candid camera shots of these things. You people talking and relaxed, not lined up taking pictures. We want some of these others. He went around and he took all kinds of pictures. Townsend never did know the first group had no film in the camera. He never did know that. So Art was good on his feet, planning it. Well, let's see now. How's our time doing? At around 1952, 52, we had, at that time, 1952, one thing, and a situation in which we almost lost the division. It was almost demise. when I went there in 1915, we had all our staff was there. The director of the program upstairs came to me and says, I would like for you to attend our staff meeting, weekly staff meeting, and report on your operations. He says, there needs to be a unified approach in Cincinnati of the public health service. And it says, this is a way to do this. If you come and tell me, and we'll see that it's handled that way, we'll be the people that represent you. I said, I'll have to think about this a minute and get approval. That was the end of that. I didn't give any more thought. I saw that trap right away. Well, about 3 weeks later, Dr. Fairhall came to my office and he says, look, I got some news for you. You're not going to like. He says, that was about a Thursday, middle of the week. He says, starting Monday, toxicology and our laboratory is going to be under new management. He says, we're going to be part of the upstairs organization and no longer part of industrial hygiene. He said, you're not going to like this. You can't do anything about it. It's already established. As a matter of fact, it's going to happen Monday. I said, all right, let's take a look at this. I said, don't go anywhere. We'll have some more comment on this later on. I call Jimmy Townsend. He was a very close friend of Charlie Williams Sr., head of Bureau of State Services. We were very close friends. And only that, at that time, there was a prediction that earlier that Jimmy Townsend was potential as a Surgeon General. So when I turned that, he went to Charlie Williams. He called me within the hour and he says, you tell Dr. Fairhall that all plans that ever existed to move upstairs have been canceled. He says, tell him as of this hour, he is no longer in charge of toxicology, and order has now been written returning him to Washington. He says, you are authorized to go out and find a replacement. And I got Dr. Stockinger as replacement, Dr. Fairhall. And you know the history of him, his contributions to our division and to the public health service, TLVs and areas like that, and research. At this time, then, some administrative problems arose, which did not have its influence on us. Dr. Seward Miller, who was in the regional office in Chicago, had some reason for immediate removal for reassignment. And they said, well, Dr. Townsend's about to resign. Let's put him in head of the Division of Occupational Health. He had absolutely no experience at all in the subject area. And so we'll put him in charge. Well, they did. Dr. Townsend was reassigned as Chief Medical Officer of the Panama Canal. Bloomfield, in 50, retired, and he went to the as an industrial hygiene consultant to South America, the countries in South America. They had the replacement then for Townsend with Seward Miller. And then we had, at that time then, a medical association said, this operation in Cincinnati field corridor is going pretty much, it's large enough to have a medical director. So a medical director was appointed. I was reassigned from that out to Salt Lake City to head up that field station and head up a diatomaceous earth study on the West Coast. They brought in in medical persons, direct laboratories. And then we had a succession of changes. In the administrative in Washington, we went from, within a period of about 10 years plus, we went from Townsend to Stuart Miller, Harold Magnuson, Clark Cooper, and we had about 6 or 7 administrators. None of them with experience in occupational health, except Clark Cooper. Clark Cooper was he was in a hospital in San Francisco, public health service in San Francisco, heading up internal medicine. So his mainly related more to ours than any of these others would have. And he came to Cincinnati. He headed up that operation. And he was able to really organize and carry it forward in a very sensible fashion. So Doug Lee was the one that had preceded him. Doug Lee was there for a couple of years. For some reason he had an emergency and he left the service. And they brought Clark Cooper in. Doug Lee did bring in some physiology experts and ergonomics. He introduced that into our Cincinnati operations. Then things began resty. Oh, the other was Murray Brown, as head of the administration out in Division in Washington. Things became resty, very resty. It is reported, I'll put it this way, that the Surgeon General received a letter, internal letter from within the organization, recommending the demise of industrial hygiene and that any of its laboratory other components be taken on by other programs in the service which might have an interest, that it would save a lot of money and it would be better organized and handled on that basis. For some reason, the Surgeon General, I won't name names here. I know the names, but I won't name them. He said he would put this in the whole basket. The word got out that this is in the works, that this recommendation had been made. We got a hold of Norton Nelson, who was head of the Environmental Health Association, something like that. Got a hold of Murray Brown, got a hold of William Fry, from the University of Louisiana. And we got the help of the director of CIO, the labor organization, AFL-CIO, and then another group. They worked together and they developed a program, a paper, the health of 80 million Americans, and where we should go in industrial hygiene. This was presented to the Surgeon General. He didn't take any specific action on it, but it provided a holding action. If it hadn't happened, our division would have been demised again at that time, if it hadn't been for Murray Brown. But we survived that. And at that time, the succession went to BOSH, Bureau of Occupational Safety and Health, and to NIOSH. I won't cover any farther than that, because I won't cover the West Virginia operation, because that wasn't a part of those operations. This is a general profile of some of the early history. I'd be glad to discuss other aspects. The primary reason was they had a facility in which the public service already had an operation on the top floor. Therefore, the expense rent and anything like that would be less if we had a building all our own. It was uneconomic, and that we had already service had an operation ongoing. That was the reason. No, that we knew. This attorney knew each other. We knew Bob Kehoe very well, and he was not a factor. The state of Ohio was not a factor, although I knew the state health officer was assigned from the public health service as state health director on assignment, and we knew him, and he knew why we came to Cincinnati. We were all interrelated, but none of those were reasons for moving that. Let's see now. I think we have a couple pictures here we can show you. You might be interested in. That's one in which we worked with the state of Illinois in a corporate study of Foundries in Illinois. Shake out. This is the diatomaceous earth study in California. This is bag loading, shakedown and loading, and it had exhaust ventilation around. The union responsible in a way, but the request was made by the state health department. But the unions were the original cause. That there was a problem of pneumoconiosis in that industry, and the working conditions weren't all too good. And they requested a study. The state said, we're not equipped to do this. We'll ask the Public Health Service to do it. So it was a joint study between Public Health Service and the State Departments of Health in California, Nevada, and Oregon. Well, I can tell you the ones which I related to in these areas. We had a meeting with management and with labor, independently and together. We proposed our study and what we were to do, and we requested that they have full cooperation from the industry as we chose the plants we wanted to participate for specific reasons, locations, size, and things like that. Early on in that, the State Department of Health would be the ones who would bring us in because they had right of entry to legal procedures. But we had no right of entry ourselves. Interesting story on that, on the diatomaceous earth. We had a plant that we were setting up in Oregon, I think it was. Our team and the team from the state there, they went to the gates and they wouldn't let them in. Locked them out. I had a call from the person from the State Department of Health saying, if you can't do something in a hurry, we're going to padlock it ourselves, and they won't be able to get in or out. And it says, it's very attentive. What shall I do? I said, wait 1 hour. Wait 1 hour, and I'll contact you. You don't go away from the phone. You stay there. And this was the John Spanville plant. I got hold of Ken Smith, medical director. I said, bro, he said, put your diplomacy hat on, Ken. You got a problem out here. And I related to him. And I says, I don't think you dare not let our team in. He says, I agree with you. He says, how much time can I said, I'd let them in an hour. Well, within a half hour, the management opened the gates and let the team in to study. So there's various ways of doing it once we get the situation clarified of where we stand. Well, it came about, we were the Division of Occupational Hygiene until Seward Miller came in. He renamed it Division of Occupational Health. He didn't like the word industrial hygiene. He changed it to Division of Occupational Health. He left, and then we had several, within the period of, I named all these people that were director of our division. They all had different organizations. We were in at least six different organizations. One of them was named BOSH finally, B-O-S-H, Bureau of Occupational Safety and Health. That's when Murray Brown came in. it finally became the predecessor of NIOSH. Because Mark Key, at the time, was with Bosch, medical officer, dermatology, and he went on to become chief of NIOSH. But that was the transition there. I'd say there, on two situations, the chances were very slim that the Division of Industrial Hygiene would continue to exist, and there could ever have been a NIOSH if it hadn't been for the experience and tact of Jimmy Townsend on the one and Murray Brown on the other, and their experience in medical administration. Our division has been destroyed in there on two different occasions, no doubt in my mind at all. They can give credit for that. They didn't know much about occupational health, but they knew a lot about administration. See, the problem here with this natural diatomaceous of Earth was rather innocuous in itself. When the calcined it, it turned into a crystalline form, which is very, very hazardous. This is more of the arsenal work. I think you all know that I was in an explosion in World War II. You won't hear about that. The operation we were studying was making incendiary powder for tracer bullets. It used very, very finely aluminum metal, magnesium metal, and several others of that category. They were so explosive that oxygen had to be absolutely excluded. They used carbon tetrachloride to exclude the oxygen. So we had a little interest in finding what was going on there. And the operation is such that they'd have a colander, and we'd go back and forth and mix these ingredients together. And only 4 people were allowed in the room. 2 workers, the supervisor, 3 workers. And they got rid of 1 worker, and they allowed 1 of us to go in. It was about noon time, and I said to the other, well, who goes in there? I know it. I said, yeah, let's flip a nickel. I flipped a nickel. He had the assignment. Then I stepped behind a barrier, an explosive barrier. It was glass brick, which were that they would disintegrate when the power of the explosion hit them. They wouldn't fragment it like other material would. They just turned to powder. After behind that, an explosion occurred. I was probably 3 or 4 feet away, something like that. And I ran out immediately to the main area, see if I could find my Bill, my associate. I saw him out there about 20 feet away, and it was obviously beyond help. Then I started looking for the 3 other people, and then, this is the first time I've said this now to anybody, other than my wife. A boy said to me, go back. It was emphatic, soft. He said, go back. I was 20 feet away. I ran back in there. I hadn't got back. A second very large explosion occurred, in which, if I had stayed where I was, I would have been the main force of the explosion. And it was true. All that time, some other people measured, who were not on that side, measured the time between 2 explosions. It was all of 8 seconds. So I had my baptism right there. But that was the only casualty of all our arsenal crews. That was the only casualty. And we have some pictures here of Cincinnati, don't we? The field headquarters. Herb Jones and Ron Bales. They were part of our laboratory in engineering. I think we have a picture of the front of 1014 Broadway, perhaps. Here's that's the entrance here. That's that's the building. We had that for a few years. Oh, that's earlier on. No, it wasn't there. It was adjacent to it. They had adjacent to it. And we had problems there because we had to be very careful when doing lead analysis. We didn't do it when it was dusty outside. We had to have pretty good controls. I've given you a bird's eye view of some of these areas going back then. As far as our sampling is concerned, our main thing, the walkthrough was the main aspect of control. We could walk through it, as Zach Bloomfield said, if you could step in it and the dust flew up in your face, if it hurt like everything to breathe, if it burned your skin, burned your eyes, there was too much of it. Then we looked to see what controls were available, and there weren't any. Local dust insulation was the least that was available then. We say isolate it, wet it down, and things like that would control it. Separate it from other non-hazardous operations, the workers. It was that sort of a sensible approach we did for controlling exposures in the early years. I hope this has given you some insight to the earlier years and some of the people concerned. I'm just honored that I could be here representing a group of dedicated professionals in a new profession whose dedicated service made a difference in our country. We left a legend that others could pick up, advance, into another level of achievement. And I hope that that will go on from on, that we did build a firm foundation on which successive programs could build upon and make their contributions. Thank you.